Hi everyone, this is Miss Moriarty, and I'm here to discuss with us our instructional video all about RNA. Remember, as you watch the video, you want to make sure that you are taking down notes, either using the follow-along notes posted to Classroom or on a separate piece of paper with a pen or pencil. And I'm going to ask for us today to, at the end of this video, mark it as done, as well as add a picture of our completed notes for this video. All right, so let's get started. Now, we've been talking a lot about DNA. We know DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, and we just learned that DNA has the ability to replicate itself. For when our body wants to make more cells, we need to duplicate our DNA. Well, DNA has also a very other important job besides duplicating itself. It is what holds the recipe for making all of the proteins in our body. And it's actually our entire body is made out of proteins. And so DNA is kind of like our personalized instruction manual, and it's unique to you. Now, we know that it's going to control the workings of the cell. However, it's going to be trapped within the nucleus, right? That's the organelle that we house the DNA in. But how do we get those instructions to the rest of the cell? Because if you can recall, in the beginning of the school year, when we talked about organelles that we find within the cell, it's the ribosome that floats around in the cytoplasm and is attached to the endoplasmic reticulum is where proteins are made. So how do we go from the DNA inside the nucleus that can't leave the nucleus to then a ribosome located in the cytoplasm? Well, that's because DNA is going to rely on another similar molecule in order to send the code. And that molecule is known as RNA or ribonucleic acid, right? Very, very similar to our DNA molecule. Now, ribonucleic acid is also a nucleic acid just like DNA, which means it's made up of nucleotides similar to DNA. And so we know that it's made up of a sugar, a phosphate, and a nitrogen base. However, although they are similar, they do have some differences. First difference you can see here is that DNA we know is a double-stranded molecule, but RNA is single-stranded, meaning it's a lot smaller than DNA. And that's really important because if the RNA is to travel out of the nuclear envelope, it needs to be small in order to fit through the pores. Now, another striking difference between DNA and RNA are the 4 nitrogen bases that help to build our RNA. Now, you'll notice it still contains adenine, guanine, and cytosine. However, thymine is not present in RNA. Instead, it's called uracil. So it's still going to follow the base pairing rule that we see in DNA. However, every time you see an adenine in RNA, it's going to bond with a uracil instead of a thymine. Now, the last major difference we see between our DNA and RNA is actually the type of sugar that helps to make up the nucleotide. Remember, we know it's deoxyribose. That's the sugar found in DNA. But in RNA, it's called ribose. And so they're still both 5-carbon sugars, except ribose has just one more oxygen than our deoxyribose molecule. All right, guys, so let's recap what we just went over. We know that some of the differences between DNA and RNA is now we know RNA is single-stranded, smaller than DNA, which means it can leave the nucleus. Remember, right, DNA cannot. We know it contains the sugar known as ribose, and it's going to have 4 bases. At least 3 of those are similar to DNA, right? We still have adenine, guanine, and cytosine, but remember the big difference there is going to be uracil. And if you can recall, we know it's still going to follow that base pairing rule, right? C always pairs with G, but in this case, A is now going to pair with U and vice versa. Remember, there's no thymine in RNA. So here's just another visual to give you guys. Here's our DNA. We know it's double-stranded. It's comprised of our 4 bases. Here's our RNA, single-stranded, still comprised of 4 bases. Just remember it has uracil instead of our thymine. And the last slide for today, guys, is the fact that RNA actually has specific jobs in order to make our protein. And we know that that code that is held within DNA in the nucleus has to travel to the ribosome and build that protein. And there's going to be 3 types of RNA molecules we will need to be familiar with. That's a part of that then job. One is called messenger RNA. That is mRNA. That's what's going to carry the copy or code of DNA to the ribosome. The next is transfer RNA or tRNA. This type of RNA is actually going to transfer the amino acid to the ribosome. And if you can recall, an amino acid is the building block of a protein. And the last type of RNA we need to be familiar with is what's called ribosomal RNA or rRNA. And this type of RNA helps to actually build the ribosome, which is where the building of our proteins takes place. All right, guys, that's the end of our video. We want to make sure that you mark this as done, and please take a picture and submit a portion of your notes for this video to the assignment on Classroom.